not a good fit for our program given what we do.
Yeah.
So you really got to customize it because you might convince them that you're brilliant and creative and qualified to do a PhD, but if you're not,
Like why here?
like this person should go to Columbia or Michigan.
How are you?
Greetings.
Good to see you again.
Thank you for
Yeah.
coming.
No, I'm sorry I missed Friday.
Yeah, no worries. A user's warning for both of you, by the way.
Yeah.
You have both heard an earlier version of this lecture.
Okay.
And there's a degree to which, in order to give my kind of general argument,
Great.
I need to kind of,
But we have to hear things 3 times.
Yeah.
before we sink in.
no, but I just, so for both of you and Liz, and I think that's
Oh, yeah, but
cool.
the Billy Goat must
So,
be open.
but I
The
just,
what?
The little coffee.
advance
It was locked. I don't
warning
have
to
a
both
key.
of you that I'm
But
aware
let's
that
talk.
you have
So
heard of
I
it.
got
good. How was your weekend?
It was very nice.
It was good.
Thank you. And
A little
you?
recovery time?
Yeah.
No, or that does not
I know,
exist?
no, I need them, and the prior one was not, so this was. Anything in particular you would like me to say at the outset?
Just, launch me and I'll try to connect the threads for people who were here but also who weren't here.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay. Ready, Ray? Good evening, everyone. It's nice to see that we have such a talkative group this evening. My name is Liz Plater-Zyberk, and I'm one of the faculty here at the School of Architecture, the University of Miami, and this is the last of our Vincent Scully seminar lectures, which I must say I regret saying that because it's been a very interesting series of talks. At the outset, I explained that this was a seminar named after an art and architectural historian who spent almost 20 years teaching here in spring semesters and had a big effect on our faculty as well as, and students, and community, as well as an enormous effect on the field through his 40 years teaching at Yale. We started the seminar with a series of students who were given readings by Professor Scully to understand his place in our intellectual background here at the school and in the profession. We gave those readings to 3 visitors. I'm happy to see that our first visitor, Alastair Gordon, is here with us this evening. The second one was George Baird from Toronto. And of course, this evening we'll be hearing from Neil Brenner again. And it's been a very lively series of presentations. They have all been live streamed, as is this evening's. So you can go back to any of the presentations through our website, and I would, of course, urge you to do that. Neil Brenner gave us a wonderful lecture Friday, and he promised to answer all the questions from Friday today. He's a professor of urban theory at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. He's bringing information to designers and ways of thinking about design and cities, which he brings from a cross-disciplinary background. He might tell you a little bit about it again this evening. His Friday lecture was a kind of rationale or an explanation of theory as it might be applied to urbanism, and a kind of explanation of what it can contribute to our understanding of cities as well as our work with cities. I did a small introduction then that explained that his field is critical urban and regional studies, a number of publications, including the Critique of Urbanization, selected essays from which the students read certain pieces, and he has worked with colleagues internationally as well as in this country on both conferences and other publications. So there's a very broad picture here. I can't really explain it, but I love listening to it. And Neil, we look forward very much to your completion of what you began Friday.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I just want to thank again Dean El-Khoury and Professor Plater-Zyberk for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And thanks to all of you for coming. So this is obviously part 2 of a 2-lecture series. I realize that some of you were here Friday, some of you weren't. And I'm going to configure this lecture in a way so that for those of you who were here on Friday, there will be, it'll address a lot of the, I hope, a lot of the open questions that I posed in terms of thinking about alternative approaches to the urban question today. For those of you who were not here on Friday, I've configured the lecture in a way so that particularly at the beginning, I'm going to sort of not replicate, but summarize some of the arguments and theoretical maneuvers that I'm making so that you can kind of jump on board where this argument is going. So it should be equally accessible and hopefully equally interesting and stimulating and provocative for whether you hear Friday or whether you weren't. So let me just begin by returning to the question of theory, which is kind of where I began and ended the lecture on Friday. So I'm a critical urban theorist, and I think of critical urban theory as a project. And it's a project about critically interrogating the concepts, the methods, and the cartographies that we use to think about and to try to influence urbanization processes. I'm just going to repeat that formulation. I've been working on that for a while to fine-tune. So what is critical urban theory? I've got an answer. So again, let me just repeat some version of what I just said. So critical urban theory is a project, and it's a project of critically interrogating the concepts, the methods, the cartographies that we use to think about, to research, and to influence urbanization processes. So a key aspect of a critical approach to social theory, and therefore also of urban theory, for me is reflexivity, which means that we understand our theory as being embedded in the same social processes that it's trying to understand. So it's not separate from, outside of the social, from some kind of Archimedean point looking down. It's part of a dynamically changing world of urban transformation. That's a fundamental epistemological proposition that I would argue has massive implications for how we think about theory and its relation to research and to practice. But I just want to open by emphasizing one key implication of that concept of reflexivity, namely, if you think of your theory as a reflexive one, it is radically revisable, and it is radically transformable. Because the world that we are trying to theorize about, certainly in the context of capitalist urbanization, but in many other contexts as well, the world that we are trying to theorize about constantly changes. So if the world is constantly changes, if the world is constantly changing, there's a likelihood, or at least a possibility, that your theory, whatever it might be a theory of, is going to quickly become obsolete. This is fundamental. This is fundamental for me. Because the challenge of theory is to constantly critically interrogate the transformations that are ongoing around us and of which theory itself is a part. So any theory is constantly in danger of being rendered obsolete by the forward motion of social, political, economic, historical change. And basically, so I mentioned this last time, the Urban Theory Lab, which is kind of a research platform that I set up at the GSD about 7 years ago when I moved there, is specifically focused on this agenda, and more specifically, the possibility that inherited approaches to the urban question, inherited approaches to urban theory, are actually radically out of date and need to be radically updated. That's a provocative proposition, and it's a controversial one. And it's one that I want to develop with you tonight. I started to develop it last time via a critique of inherited approaches to urban theory, which I'll quickly outline at the beginning of this lecture. But I think the more, in some ways, even more controversial, but potentially also more interesting part of the argument is what kind of alternative approaches to the urban question might we develop that might be more adequate to changing social, political, spatial conditions under early 21st century capitalism. So that's the big picture, okay, in terms of my epistemological commitments and why I think theory matters, but also what I think the challenges are of theory. Theory is never, I just want to repeat this, especially for the students in the room, theory is never the solution to anything, and it's never going to tell you the truth of life. Theory is a way to orient ourselves in relation to fundamental macro historical and spatial transformations around us. We always need theory in order to act, in order to orient ourselves. But again, theory doesn't provide stability, it doesn't provide an anchor, because the world is changing and we need theory precisely in order to decipher those changes, and in so doing, to constantly reinvent our theories. So this question of reinventing the theory, for me, it's not somehow detached from the world of research, the world of design practice. It's fundamental to every element of research and design practice. Without theoretical orientation, we not only can't figure out what is to be done, we can't figure out who we are, where we are, what the parameters and constraints and possibilities are on action. So I went into that a little bit last time, but just for those of you who weren't there, on Friday, that's an important commitment for me in terms of my relation to the social sciences and also fundamentally my relation to all the design disciplines. So let me just open with a couple propositions to orient the lecture tonight. The first one is kind of what I've already been saying. The urban question presupposes and requires theory. And the point here, again, which I'll develop in more detail this evening, is that we can't really access the city or the urban without a kind of theoretical frame. It's not just kind of a pre-given condition outside our doorsteps. The city, that's what we're trying to change, the built environment. Whatever we mean when we say things like city or urban, it's always mediated through interpretive frameworks that we've got to critically interrogate. And those interpretive frameworks are oftentimes mediated through ideology. They're mediated through power relations and political strategies that are oriented towards achieving particular goals in the built environment. That's another thing that theory can help us do, is critically decipher some of the strategies and ideologies that underpin discourses about the city and the urban. So again, that articulates to points I made on Friday night. But I now want to introduce a second layer of kind of my methodology here, which really articulates to the special capacities and forms of intelligence that I think we see in the design disciplines. And that has to do with visualization. So there's kind of a two-pronged argument I want to make here, and which I'll be developing tonight. So one is simply that anytime we look at any cartography or representation, or more generally visualization of the urban, it's not just a mimetic photographic capture of the real, of ground conditions. For me, that doesn't exist. It's always mediated through some sort of broader theoretical interpretation. So anytime you look at any map, whether it's, I don't care if it's Google Maps, I don't care if it's a map from 500 years ago, or anywhere in between on almost anything, any spatial representation is mediated through politics, power, inclusion, exclusion, etc. So theory is in part about helping us decipher some of those dimensions. But more importantly, for where I want to go with my argument tonight, I believe that visual experimentation can actually provide an important method and tool for theory building. So I frame this lecture around the idea that maybe we need some new approaches to the urban question today. And part of what I'm going to be developing here is the idea that experiments with visualization, but also counter-visualization, so alternatives to some of the dominant visual ideologies that prevail in contemporary urban discourse, that can provide an interesting way to develop new concepts and new frameworks for thinking about the urban question. So visualization can be a method rather than a kind of end result. You know, you end a research project with like a visual of your outcome. For me, in collaboration with my students and colleagues in the Urban Theory Lab, visualization has become a method for actually trying to develop and test out, sometimes also abandon, theoretical concepts. So those are kind of the big kind of macro arguments that I want to develop. And as with Friday night, I'm going to frame the whole argument around this idea that we live in an urban world. And again, this will now be just a quick rehash for people who weren't here on Friday night of just kind of my critique of inherited approaches, which for those of you who were here on Friday, here's a quick review. But basically, what I argued was that the idea that the world has become urban is sort of ubiquitous, it's all around us. We take it for granted as just an empirical fact, self-evident, and I'm trying to raise some critical questions about that idea that we live in an urban world. It's not that I want to deny that we live in an urban world, but rather that we've got to ask in what sense do we live in an urban world? And if we ask that question, in what sense do we live in an urban world, we find that the dominant spatial imagination of the global urban and its possible futures pretty much rests upon the idea of the city. So the idea of we live in an urban age, an urban world, all the mainstream global urban discourses, without exception, I would submit, essentially the argument that we live in an urban world boils down to the proposition that we live in a world of cities. Cities are strategic centers for demographic, economic, ecological transformations. So on Friday night, I focused in particular on the demographic discourse about the urban age, the idea that we live in a majority urban world because putatively more than 50% of the world's population lives within cities. So I mentioned Rem Koolhaas and many other examples, Manuel Castells, Mike Davis, all of whom effectively rely on the putatively authoritative source of global urban data, the United Nations. And I spent a lot of time unpacking the history of this kind of way of thinking about urbanization as basically a property of the distribution of population between urban, that is to say city areas, and rural areas. And the argument that I made was basically that it's kind of an hourglass model of urbanization and urban change. The spatialities of urbanization themselves don't change. It's literally just a redistribution of, in this case, the population from one part of the hourglass, the rural part, into the urban part. But I just want to broaden that argument briefly tonight. The demographic is actually only one thread of contemporary mainstream global urban discourse. There are a couple other threads that also deserve mention, and even though they rely upon different kinds of data, I would argue they basically embrace an identical epistemological framework with regard to urban questions. The economic discourse about global urbanization is fundamental. This is a diagram from John Friedman's famous essay from the 1980s on global city theory. And the idea is simply that cities are important because they're command and control nodes through which and in which transnational capital coordinates global production systems. There's a kind of global consulting industry version of it from McKinsey and others, and the smart cities discourse is connected to that as well. Basically, the idea that cities are kind of centers of economic activity, command and control capacity, and of course, technological innovation related to big data, smart cities, and so forth. So the demographic, the economic, and the one other very prominent discourse about global urbanization, which really needs no summarizing here in Miami, is related to climate change. And it's basically a double-pronged argument. On the one hand, cities are at the front lines of the impacts of climate change for a whole range of reasons, that large population centers are confronted with major ecological crises and crisis tendencies related to our changing climate. But just as importantly, the other side of the equation is that increasingly cities have become incubators for various kinds of governance and design innovations in terms of how we might not so much mitigate but adapt to climate change processes. Although, of course, I think as all of you know, mitigation and adaptation are often tightly intertwined. It's not an either-or kind of choice. But the United Nations discourse on, and the UN Habitat discourse on the so-called new urban agenda, and a whole range of discussions culminating recently at the last Habitat conference last year in Quito, related to the possibility of knowledge sharing and new governance arrangements to enable cities to react to some of the tumultuous transformations that are kind of being unleashed across the urban world. And the whole idea, this is a diagram actually from Herbert Girardet, the idea of more metabolically regenerative, as Girardet puts it, urban systems, instead of relying on kind of a planetary metabolism that's that's massively wasteful. This vision of kind of urban sustainability based on the regeneration of the very capacities and resources that are used within cities. So this was a very rapid summary of obviously a lot of different discourses. A lot more could be said about the demographic, which I went into on Friday. A lot more could be said about the economic side, and a lot more could be said about the whole debate about cities and climate change. So I don't mean to overly homogenize these otherwise different discourses. There are different assumptions among many of them, different kinds of data, and of course different political orientations as well. But what they share is what I want to really draw your attention to. Despite many differences of focus and normative orientation and political strategy, they share the idea that the world is indeed urban because we live in a world of cities. So the idea of global urbanization basically boils down to the notion that cities are really, really important because of population, movement and migration, because of economic development trends, and because of ecological transformations and threats. So as I said at the outset, for me, this proposition, or any proposition really around the urban, is a theoretical dispositif. In other words, it's a framework, dispositif, just framework of interpretation. So it's not just an empirically pre-given situation, any of the examples I just gave you and any other related ones, but rather it involves a variety of interpretive assumptions that are actually quite abstract. So part of what I want to do in the lecture tonight is destabilize any notion that anyone might have of the city or even the built environment as kind of self-evident and pre-given. And that the city is a category that just refers to kind of like, oh, well, it's sort of all the dense stuff that we see outside our windows. All of those assumptions and any other assumption that we might excavate from the history of urban thought and urban design and planning practice, all of those involve abstractions. And part of what I want to do is critically interrogate some of those abstractions and argue for the need to reinvent them. So far you might be thinking, depending on your own intellectual background and experience, that the paradigms I just mentioned related to demography, economics, and ecology involve like pretty self-evident propositions. Like what else could I possibly have in mind? So let me, as a first cut into some of my arguments, just kind of put this forward as a set of propositions. So the idea of the city, and the idea that we live in a world of cities, it's not an empirically self-evident thing at all. It actually involves a fairly contentious set of abstract assumptions about how the world and how the spatiality of the world is organized, as follows. Like, I boil it down to these three elements. First of all, the idea of the city as a singularity, as a settlement type that's distinct from other settlement types. Related to that, secondly, the idea that this singular entity is bounded, that it has clear borders around it, and is thus separated from the non-city outside. In the dominant kind of mainstream United Nations model, as I've already mentioned, that outside is referred to as the rural. There might be other labels for it. You might differentiate the rural into suburban, towns, hinterland, wilderness, oceans, etc. But I'm going to have a lot to say about that putative distinction between the city and the non-city, or the urban and the non-city. But for the moment, the assumption is not only that it's singular, but that it's bounded. And then the third is actually a quite totalizing and universalizing discourse. Because the assumption is that this idea, this unit, this bounded unit, the city, is generalized and diffused around the world. So of course there are different types of cities. Miami is different from, I don't know, Sao Paulo or Shanghai or Boston or wherever. But the unit itself, the unitness of that unit, the city, is understood to be effectively, as it were, universal, such that you can plug in different contents across historical time and space, but the unit is fixed across time and space. So in a certain way, it's another version of the hourglass diagram I put up before. You can put different amounts of sand and different types of sand into the hourglass, but the unit itself is understood to be like a general kind of container that you can find every place in the world. And just again, what I really focused on in detail on Friday night, but which is also quite relevant here, is this sort of algebraic, or apparently algebraic, formula which comes from Kingsley Davis, a very important mid-20th century American demographer. And I went into detail on Kingsley Davis's work and his data collection exercises, which were really formative for the United Nations in trying to develop the first data set on global urban population as of the 1960s. But what's most important for my purposes tonight is that I want to argue that this is still to this day the conception of urbanization that prevails in mainstream design discourse, in mainstream planning discourse, in mainstream social science discourse. And it's also tacitly embraced within a lot of radical, I come out of kind of radical or critical urban studies, it's tacitly embraced by many of my colleagues in the kind of Marxian or radical or critical field of urban studies, kind of paradoxically. And it basically boils down to the idea that urbanization is the growth of cities relative to the rest of the territory. So it's a very city-centric, as I'm going to call it, conception of urbanization. that it's basically a measurement of the number of people or the structural importance of cities relative to everything else in the world. And the dominant concept of urbanization is basically that. So the question that I want to pose, and it's hopefully going to, you may agree, you may disagree, but usually these are provocations that stimulate a pretty interesting debate, so hopefully that'll be the case with all of you tonight. I want to pose this question, and this is kind of my obsession these days for all the work that I do in my classrooms and in my writing. To what degree is this inherited city-centric dispositif or framework of urban theory an adequate basis for deciphering contemporary, by which I mean early 21st century transformations? So again, it's the question that I began with, and I'm going to keep returning to it. That's the guiding question. To what degree is this framework and its variations thereof adequate? So let me give you three provocations, just to give you a sense of where I'm going, and then I'll unpack it kind of step by step. First provocation. By the way, you might be thinking, so far, you might be thinking, again, what else does he have in mind? Of course, urbanization is the growth of the city. So if that's what you're thinking, that's awesome, because let's see if you're still thinking that, or whether I can destabilize that in the next half an hour. So 3 provocations. First provocation. Maybe the city is not a settlement type or a spatial form, but maybe it's one element within a broader process of socio-spatial transformation. What if? Just to open it up. Again, please note from this formulation, the claim is not that cities don't exist or that they don't matter. The question that I'm trying to bring into focus for us is whether urbanization is exhausted by the growth of the city. And I'm going to argue, as you can probably already guess, that it's not. The city is part of the story, but if we reduce urbanization to city growth, we have not understood urbanization, I submit. That's first provocation. Second, maybe urban restructuring is not simply a mutation of city space or urban regional space, but maybe it's a multi-scalar process of implosion and explosion, kind of concentration and the transformation of whatever's going on outside that or beyond that concentration. And as such, it encompasses a whole range of socio-spatial, landscape, ecological conditions of the built and unbuilt environment. So that the growth of the city, the agglomeration process, is primarily, it might be primarily rather than just secondarily or marginally interconnected with a whole range, a whole cascade of conditions and transformations that are not themselves associated with a condition of agglomeration. Second provocation. That brings me to a third, which is a very, I'll say a bit about Henri Lefebvre as the lecture unfolds. This is a very Lefebvrean proposition. Maybe it's not the world that has become urban, that whole idea that we live in an urban world. That's maybe an unproductive way to think about what's going on. But maybe it's the urban that has become planetarized. The urban has become planetarized. The difference, which again I'm going to unpack as I proceed, if we say the world has become urban, you have a concept of a sphere that's empty. Like, I don't know, I'm giving a presentation on the Catalan planner Ildefons Cerdà tomorrow at the GSD. So I've been thinking about Cerdà. He was actually the person who invented the concept of urbanization. Long story. Cerdà begins his famous tract on general theory of urbanization with the idea, fill the earth, fill the earth. It's one of the formulations in the frontispiece. So that's this idea of like the earth of the world is empty and you want to fill it up with the urban. So maybe, but on the other hand, does the world, like what does that mean, the world, can it really pre-exist the processes that are producing and transforming the terrain of interdependence and maybe collective life, both human and non-human, and ecological, that's associated with, quote unquote, the world. So the idea that the urban has become planetarized, it directs attention, for me very important, to the processes. Instead of starting with the idea of an empty space that gets filled up, we have to look at the processes and their spatialization. Henri Lefebvre writes about the production of space. Space is not simply just a thing or a platform, it's a process. So this goes in this direction. And let me just say a little more about Lefebvre. This book cover from my good friend Andy Merrifield wrote a book on Lefebvre among many other books. But for me, it's a beautiful image for this moment in my argument. because I don't actually know what was going on when they took this picture of Lefebvre and he's kind of going like this, but it embodies the epistemological problem that I'm fascinated with and trying to kind of bring into relief in this presentation. Namely, something is emerging, the world is being transformed, and we can't quite see it yet, and we need orientation. And so his propositions are kind of in that spirit, and so are mine. It's not a finished theory, but it's an attempt to understand the phenomenon of emergence and the challenge of reinventing our categories in the face of the emergence. So Lefebvre, it was also Lefebvre, this is from his 1970 book, La Révolution urbaine, The Urban Revolution, and he, I just direct your attention to the bottom portion, he develops this idea of implosion, explosion, as a way to think about the possibility of generalized urbanization he's writing again in the late 20th century. But just to give you a sense of where I'm going, a lot more could be said about Lefebvre's concept. I won't go there right now. But just to give you a sense of where I'm going, this is the cover of a book that I assembled a couple years ago, which uses that title, implosion, explosion, a phrase I've already used a couple times. And I put Lefebvre's, really the first line of his book, La Révolution urbaine, on the cover. I'll begin with the following hypothesis. Society has become completely urbanized. Does anyone know what this book cover is an image of? Anybody want to, if you know, maybe just shout it out. Oftentimes people are familiar with it because it's pretty widely discussed in the popular media. Alberta, it is Alberta, but anyone else? Tar sands. It's the tar sands. So it's northern Alberta, Canada, and it's a zone of incredibly toxic fossil fuel extraction, which is in turn connected via pipelines, which are highly contested spaces across the continental US, all the way down the Mississippi to various ports, to sort of circulate this basically petroleum fuel into the kind of world urban system. And just to give you a sense of where I'm going, and then I'll unfurl it in a couple separate steps, for me, this particular condition and variations thereof around the world is as essential to contemporary urbanization as are the kind of more standard images we equate with urbanization of dense built environments, skyscrapers, and so forth. And any theory, any urban theory that aspires to help us understand contemporary capitalist urbanization has to be able to deal with both. If it's only focused on the big, dense settlement spaces where a lot of this stuff is consumed, it is a deeply one-sided, and I would argue deeply misleading, and maybe even dangerous theory of urbanization, because it claims to theorize the whole, and it's actually theorizing the part. And it, as it were, black boxes fundamental metabolic processes and their social and ecological consequences. So where I'm going with this is to extend, to open up a broader conceptualization of urbanization, not to abandon the question of the city, but to resituate the question of the city in relation to many industrialized, socially and environmentally destructive, toxic spaces like this. So it's kind of an invitation to open up our vision of what the urban is. Also because, and again, just to summarize where I'm going, like right up front, I fundamentally believe that all of us in the design disciplines, all of them, planning, architecture, landscape architecture, urban design, if we're trying to deal with the urban, we have to deal with this. We have to find ways to use our forms of intelligence and modes of intervention to deal with these types of places, even as we try to plan and design for more traditionally understood urban areas. I think that's the provocation for all of you as designers. So let me now turn to the visual side of this presentation. So I said at the outset, visualization always presupposes theory, et cetera, interpretation. But more importantly for this argument, visualization and counter-visualization can be a means to build an alternative theory. So I want to introduce a series of, as it were, counter-visualization exercises, all of which I'm going to argue seriously destabilize the idea that we live in an urban world because we live in a world of cities. They open up, I think, fundamental new horizons for thinking about urbanization that include and yet transcend the city. And they enable us to rework the question, is the future or is the world urban? So these are going to be some different, they're different in many ways, the 4 exercises that I want to share. They have different epistemological orientations, different cartographic and visualization strategies, different data sources, but they have shared analytical orientations. They all point towards what I'm going to call a more extended conceptualization of urbanization. So that's basically where I'm going to go in the remaining, like 30 minutes, and then I'll draw some conclusions, and we can hopefully have a debate about these arguments. So first, counter-visualization. I want to counterpose 2 different ways of seeing the city or studying the city. The first is putting the city under the microscope, and the second is putting the city under eclipse. So stay with me, I'll unpack. So the microscope. This is a microscope from the 1920s, and the reason I chose one from the 1920s is because if you look at the most important kind of American tradition of urban sociology of the 20th century, the Chicago School, you'll find that their dominant approach to the urban question was to scale the urban more and more microscopically. They argued that the truth of the urban condition could be found in the particularities, the fine-grained fabric of neighborhoods. The key formulation, there are many versions of Chicago School authors developing this proposition, but Ernest Burgess, who is really one of the founders of that tradition at the University of Chicago, writes as follows. He says, the project in which I'm directly engaged is an attempt to apply these methods of investigation to a cross-section of the city, to put this area, as it were, under the microscope, and so to study in more detail and with greater control and precision the processes which have been described here in that essay in the large. So the claim is that more detailed, more fine-grained scale, it's a very scalar argument, more fine-grained scale can illuminate the essence of what's going on. So again, the microscope, put the city under the microscope. What Mike Davis once referred to as the most famous diagram in social science. I don't know if that's true, but in my classes, I often sort of affectionately refer to this as the dartboard model of the urban. It's kind of like you throw the darts and see where they land. But it's a model of he called it the growth of the city. So the lines are actually dynamic. It's not just a static cross-section. It's a vision of how the city is changing as these different concentric rings get reorganized again and again and again. But the method of the Chicago School was really not even to focus on this local or urban scale. It was to drill in to some of the different neighborhoods following their so-called human ecology approach to understand some of the processes and their outcomes. A couple years ago, there was a fascinating exhibition at University of Chicago from Burgess's papers. None of this stuff is really published, but it turns out they did a lot of kind of amazing visualizations of some of the empirical phenomena that they were trying to track, which this kind of speaks to the broader argument that I'm trying to make. So the kind of land use differentiation of the central business district, motion picture licenses in different theaters in the 1930s. This is all Chicago, of course. Families with others, which I think that means families that have a domestic servant. I'm not entirely sure, but that's also an interesting kind of map of both class and race in Chicago at that time. Number of manic depressives, so a very important tradition of urban sociology, which my good friend and former colleague at NYU, Eric Kleinenberg, wrote a brilliant book, some of you may have read, Heat Wave, which was basically following some of the same methods of like, what's the concentration of heat-related deaths in different neighborhoods of Chicago, and how does that ecology of heat-related death help you understand both heat and its effects on everyday life worlds and cities, but also issues of class and race. So this is a venerable, to this day, fundamental tradition of urban sociology. You drill into the details. But what I want to do as a provocation and a first exercise in counter-visualization is contrast that method of putting the city under the microscope to the idea of putting the city under eclipse. And this is inspired by the work of my friend at the ETH Zurich, Milica Topolovic, who has been developing this idea in her research on Singapore. So she was inspired by the the tabula Peutingeriana, forgive my non-existent Latin for anyone who actually knows Latin. But what Milizza noticed in looking at this very famous 13th century map of the Roman roads network was that the roads extending out of Rome look like the rays from the sun. And what Milizza was interested and is interested in doing in a book that she's completing on Singapore is basically putting the sun under eclipse such that you could start to see some of the broader urban processes that are connected to supporting that particular city. So this idea of putting the city under eclipse to reveal, and here's another fundamental concept for me, the urban fabric, not just the urban, but the fabric, what Lefebvre calls the tissu urbain, the urban tissue, the fabric. So Milizza Topolovic, in a book which will hopefully very soon be published, The Architecture of Territory, conducted with her colleagues at the Future Cities Lab in Singapore, basically develops a metabolic analysis of Singapore. Singapore is a very interesting case for this kind of a study because, as I think everyone here will know, its hinterland is completely outside it. It's it's a relatively compact, dense urban zone in Southeast Asia, and so almost all of its metabolic functions entail reliance on extra-territorial zones. So what Milizza Topolovic did was try to map with her colleagues a number of these broader metabolic dynamics that support and result from Singapore's development and which are outside of it. So she looked at, for example, so immediately we go outside the terrestrial zone to the maritime zone. And this is quite relevant to thinking about connecting this to our visit to the port on Friday here in Miami. So the urban here, Singapore Strait, is one of the busiest maritime thoroughfares in the world. It's an incredibly dense, dangerous, high-traffic zone. So that becomes part of the urban fabric of Singapore. She looks at energy supply, and this is just a snippet of a much broader investigation of kind of gas fields that supply Singapore with its energetic requirements. And in her broader book, they've got basically elaborate chapters with visualizations on each of these different aspects. So soil and sand. So we talked about land reclamation in Miami to build the port. In Singapore, that's even more massive, like constant importing of sand. Where does it come from? Well, you got to read Milizza's book to find out. Water, a fundamental issue. Singapore is almost completely dependent on water pipes that go up into Malaysia in order to supply it with water. If you cut those pipes, then Singapore is in a lot of trouble. So it's very geopolitically contested. Food, the workforce, and then energy. So this I think it's pretty straightforward on a certain level, and it actually goes to the heart already of the framework that I'm trying to develop, which is that if you think of the urban and urbanization as a metabolism, the city is a site for that broader metabolic transformation. But the metabolic transformation and the metabolic circuitry transcends the city. So in a lot of my research with my students at the GSD, we're kind of looking at these different flows of energetics, materials, water, and waste. And once you do that and you start to visualize it, you get very quickly up to the planetary scale. It's multi-scalar and it's constantly changing, but those metabolic processes have a history. It wasn't always kind of planetary. So the move from kind of the mid-19th century more regionalized hinterland, which still exists, including in Miami, to a much more planetarized hinterland is fundamental to the understanding of urbanization processes. Let me also emphasize, before I move on to the next visualization, that most cities in the world combine differentially scaled metabolic processes. In other words, there will be a regional hinterland. There might be a national hinterland. There might be an international or continental one, and then eventually it goes up to the planetary. And again, that's an empirical question to track that. And there are scholars who are actually doing that. And it's quite a fascinating thing. And it connects directly up to debates about urban sustainability, of whether if you really find a way to regionalize, or as it were, re-regionalize the footprint, is that more sustainable, depending on what you mean by sustainability. So maybe we can return to that question in the discussion period. It's actually a bit more complicated than it might seem. The standard assumption that local is more sustainable, maybe, maybe not. We got to debate about it. But let me blast forward. Second counter visualization. This one is one of my favorites. This is inspired by Rainer Bonham, sort of brilliant highly eclectic architectural critic and writer and theorist. So he did a collaboration in 1965 with a graphic designer and artist named Francois Delagré, and in which he was reflecting on the relationship between the house, that is to say the building itself, and the environment outside the house. And in that particular essay, this diagram appears. It's a pretty crazy diagram. Like, what exactly is it a diagram of? When you look at it, it's all this kind of pipes and infrastructure, and it's completely indecipherable, except he's got a caption up there. So what does the caption say? I certainly can't read that. Even when it's right in front of me, I can barely read it. So here's what it says. And it's, for those of you who have read Rainer Bonham before, you'll recognize his distinctive style of prose, very playful and poetic in a certain way. He says the following: "This Baroque ensemble of domestic gadgetry epitomizes the intestinal complexity of gracious living. In other words, this is the junk that keeps the pads swinging." It's kind of funny, I think. The house itself has been omitted from the drawing. So he's basically saying, in order to have all the functionality, whether in a room like this or in a house, there's all this stuff that's in the floors or in the ceiling or behind the wall, all the circuitry. I mean, this is also part of, as Rem Koolhaas has actually recently argued in his last Venice Biennale exhibition, that's part of kind of the development of modern, in quotation marks, architecture, is to put all that infrastructure, as it were, behind the scenes. That happens on the scale of the city too. Like with Haussmannization, as we know, you put a lot of the pipes and infrastructure, as it were, in the background so that the city can be kind of a space of experience and consumption. So I'm very interested in this idea as a visualization strategy. There's a lot that could be said about Dalagré's diagram and what Bonham says about it. But the notion that it's kind of a radical provocation. I'm going to draw a diagram of a house, but I'm going to omit the house from the diagram. So given what I'm trying to do in relation to the city and the urban, hopefully it's already clear to you why I would be inspired by that methodological approach. So what I did was I decided to be a little playful as well with Bonham's already playful text by substituting some of my own vocabulary into his formulation as follows. This Baroque ensemble of extended urbanization, a concept I'll develop, epitomizes the intestinal complexity of urban living. In other words, this is the infrastructure that permits concentrations of urban life to exist and grow. So what would it look like to omit the city from the drawing of the urban? And I'm just trying to get us all thinking. I haven't fully come up with such a diagram, although that's part of what a lot of my research is about. But these are some mainly geospatial images which hopefully will give you a sense of the direction I'm trying to push us. The city itself has been omitted from the drawing. The city itself has been omitted from the drawing. These are obviously zones of industrial resource extraction in various parts of the world. The city itself has been omitted from the drawing. So the mining in the Peruvian Andes, mining in Venezuela, in a much broader mining region. The city itself has been omitted from the drawing. The city itself has been omitted from this drawing. So it's a map of evaporation ponds of a potash mine in Utah. The city itself has been omitted from the drawing. Iron ore tailings pond, again in the United States. But I want to take it even further. What about this? The city itself has been omitted from the drawing. So there's a dense concentration of some workers in this oil platform in the North Sea, but it's connected to the urbanization process. Here's precision agriculture in Minnesota, but you could find basically the same kind of map in, I don't know, the Mato Grosso industrial soybean farming in parts of Brazil. Highly rationalized, highly industrialized agricultural landscapes, which are directly connected to, I would argue, world urbanization, and so on and so forth. The city itself has been omitted from the drawing. This one is one of the biggest cattle ranches, actually, in the world, in the San Joaquin Valley of California. So it's an agglomeration, but it's an agglomeration of non-human animals that are about to be slaughtered rather than of people, of human people, as Timothy Morton would say. The city itself has been omitted from the drawing. I've got to put this one up where I come from, Central Florida. I'm from Lakeland. The city itself has been omitted from the drawing. Yeah, there are lots of cities and big settlements or moderately sized settlements, but it's a broader urbanization process connected to landscape, industrial landscape transformation for phosphate, which is fertilizer. Logistic spaces, such as the port that many of us visited or some of us visited on Friday. The city itself has been omitted from the drawing. So it's the infrastructure. It's a big part of it. So here's Long Beach, but there are readily available satellite images of Miami's port as well that look pretty similar on a smaller scale. Rail networks, the city itself has been omitted from the drawing. I take this even further, like I want to really push this far. So telegraph cables from the late 19th century, early 20th century under the oceans, and today superimposed upon those earlier technical systems are submarine cables that make all of our smartphones and all of our digital infrastructure work. That's basically holding a smartphone, using a smartphone, you're directly connected to all of this. Large-scale logistics projects, whether it's the One Belt, One Road project that China is currently promoting, or the URSA in Latin America, a massive kind of mega urbanization project to create new corridors of commodity circulation across the continent from coast to coast. And with Nikos Katsikis, my collaborator on some of this stuff, we would take it all the way out to the planetary scale, but also back down to very local scales. So the question, these are some pretty well-known Bertinsky images, waste landscapes, not only at the scale of like a tire dump, but something that's been in the news recently, the Pacific garbage gyre, which it turns out is way bigger than anybody thought it was, incredibly disturbing. So it's an agglomeration of plastic at different kind of clusters, but significant territories within the oceanic landscape are actually being fundamentally transformed through industrial waste. And again, just as a provocation, I take it way, way out to spaces where there are very few, if any, human inhabitants at all, cracking ice sheets in Antarctica and elsewhere. And then ultimately space junk. This is a super interesting visualization from a German artist named Michael Najar of space junk. So all that stuff floating around, not just the satellites, but the junk is directly connected, I would argue, to urbanization. And we need to develop a framework that can grasp that. Two more counter visualizations, but hopefully it's already clear the direction this is going. But I want to share a couple more just to kind of develop some of these concepts. So the third counter visualization speaks to the question of the idea of the economy of cities, which I alluded to at the outset of the presentation. So this map is a pretty famous map that was introduced by Richard Florida, the idea of the spiky world. So in contrast to Thomas Friedman's book from some years ago of the world is flat because of globalization, leveling all differences, Richard Florida and his colleagues did a pretty interesting visualization of GDP. And basically what they showed, they were using the nighttime lights map, which I'll come back to in just a moment, to basically argue that the vast majority of productive output in the world is not evenly spread across national territories the way the idea of GDP suggests it is, since it's a national property or a national indicator. It's actually clustered within cities. So they reaggregated, it's a pretty interesting statistical exercise, they reaggregated national GDP statistics using the nighttime lights data set as a way to show that most GDP is actually produced within big urban areas. Hence, the image of the spiky world. So looking at this, you get an interesting perspective on the capitalist world economy, which gives you the impression that basically cities are self-propelled dynamic centers, and that everything else that doesn't have any spikes or where the spikes are low is pretty much irrelevant or marginal. So it's another version of this idea of the city. We live in an urban age because we live in a world of cities. So with my collaborator, Nikos Katsikis, we developed some counter visualizations to this particular conceptualization. So this is just Nikos plugging Florida's data into his own software program. And then what Nikos did in order to develop this idea was he looked at a very different data set, which some of you might be familiar with, the human appropriation of net primary production, which was developed by ecologists at the Institute for Social Ecology in Vienna. And it's a complicated data set, but in a nutshell, it's basically a representation of the potential for biomass production. It's a way of analyzing and then mapping the productivity of the Earth in relation to agriculture and other forms of biomass appropriation. The oceans actually probably should show up in this data set because a lot of biomass is, of course, appropriated from the oceans, but it's just terrestrial. But, and just to put it in design context, Richard Weller and his colleagues last year did some very similar visualizations of just different land use conditions related to croplands, related to pasture land. This is all on the web, this really interesting project they did on the Atlas for the End of the World, which gets at some of these same tendencies. So what Nikos Katsikis then did was he juxtaposed the spiky world, which is kind of on the top, to the human appropriation for net primary production index. And then what he did in a kind of gesture of hopefully provocation, but also kind of very theoretically sort of rigorous, was to create what we like to call the cave model of the global urban system. So in this model, the spikes from Richard Florida's model are now inverted. So they now look like almost metabolic black holes where lots of stuff is consumed. So they become, I always get it mixed up. Are the stalactites the ones that point up or down? Down. So stalactites. Thank you. I always get it mixed up. So the stalactites are basically now the spikes. The spikes become the stalactites. And most importantly, the bottom, stalagmites, human appropriation of net primary production is now kind of the stalagmites. And the idea, so this is not a rigorous kind of relational diagram. Like we can't prove that there's a direct link between biomass appropriation here and GDP growth there. But it's intended as kind of a destabilization of the standard cognitive map from someone like Richard Florida and many others working in that kind of global cities paradigm. That instead of just thinking of the spikes as self-propelled zones of economic capacity and power, we have to think of them in a relational context in which there are any number of metabolic interdependencies that enable all of that GDP production. So it's another cut into the problematique of urban metabolism that I summarized with reference to Milica Topolovic's work. So here's another one from Nikos. And we don't have the budgetary capacity at the moment, but hopefully someday, somewhere, we want to actually build like a 3D model. Because I can't tell you, let me just go back, I can't tell you how many conferences I've been to in design, architecture, urban planning, urbanism, where you see like a 3D model of this on the table. And it's all about urbanism and the global urban age. And you're led to sort of think, okay, like this is where it's at. This is everything that we need to focus on. Forget about everything else. Like I've seen probably 5 of those myself, and I've seen several times more, via Twitter and the web of just, it's pretty easy to do, and it's a pretty provocative visualization. But I haven't seen anyone do, and we haven't done it yet, something like this, but it's not that complicated to do, and it would immediately change the conversation. Let me share one more counter-visualization with you, which comes from my work, my collaboration with my students in the Urban Theory Lab. So every spring, I do a research practicum. It's kind of a studio. It's a research studio, in effect, in the Urban Theory Lab. And for several years, we did one on what we call the extreme territories of urbanization. So we do kind of studio crits at the end of the semester, just as with a design studio. These are just sort of scenes from some of our work. And at some point, we did an exhibition which went around to Melbourne School of Design. We took it to Santiago de Chile. And we had the opportunity, in collaboration with Milica Topolovic, whose work I mentioned earlier, and Christian Schmidt, one of my co-authors and collaborators at the ETH in Zurich, to take it to the Shenzhen Biennale. So we've been able to take this around. It's been pretty provocative. And I just want to give you a sense of what that was all about as a fourth counter-visualization. Here, the starting point is not the spiky world, but the nighttime lights, which I mentioned earlier. So the nighttime lights is another kind of widely circulating visualization of global urbanization. It's actually, if you look at the journal Urban Studies, it's like probably one of the 2 most important urban studies journals in the social sciences anyway. These days, most of us don't ever see the actual material copy of the journal. We just get it on PDFs. But if you happen to grab a material copy of the journal Urban Studies, the cover of every issue is basically this, the nighttime lights, as if to say, this is our object, this is what we study. So again, collaborating with Nikos Katsikis on some of this stuff. So the standard assumption that most of us would have, if we haven't actually studied it about the nighttime lights, is that this is a photograph. It's like somebody up there, a satellite, click, and then you somehow aggregate them all, which is actually how the first attempts to develop nighttime lights maps back in the 1970s were developed, where you aggregate a bunch of them so that you get like a cloudless night in every part of the world, and then you create like a giant tapestry. So you think it's a photograph. It's actually not. First point here is that it's highly scrubbed and processed based on meta-theoretical assumptions. So this is, again, relying on work with Nikos Katsikis, this is the unscrubbed map from Europe and parts of North Africa and Central Asia. So it's pretty messy. And then this is the scrubbed. So unscrubbed, scrubbed. So if it's unscrubbed, it's basically, there's a lot of other stuff, most obviously light pollution. Maybe it's light pollution, maybe it's not. I want to think about that. If you scrub it, part of what it does is it, as it were, cleans up the boundaries. So one assumption going on is that the people who are doing the processing of the nighttime lights data have the assumption that the urban is a bounded entity. So in order to make the data usable and visually appropriate, you've got to go from this to this. But there's actually more going on in the move from this to this than just cleaning up the boundary. So Nikos put a bunch of stuff in red, which disappears. Any guesses as to what's in red that gets dropped out? Industrial processes. Correct. Anybody want to be more specific? You're absolutely right, but any particular oil? Anybody? Yeah, sorry? Gas flares, exactly. So, exactly. So, Sahara Desert and maybe, Sahara Desert and more noticeably still, up in the North Sea, there are all these nighttime lights. So what could that be about? Well, obviously, it's oil platforms and gas flares. And let me give you another example that's even more dramatic. So if you were a Martian looking at the nighttime lights map, and you saw the area in the white box, you would think, wow, that's one of the big megalopolises of the Midwest, of the United States Midwest. But what Nikos Katsikis did on this map was he juxtaposed nighttime lights to population density in orange. So the very strange situation here in the US Midwest, where most of the nighttime lights correspond to a zone like Chicago, most obviously, high population density. But out there in the Midwest, or wherever that box is, there are all these nighttime lights, and apparently nobody lives there. Anybody know what's going on out there? Fracking, bullseye, fracking. So massive expansion, it's more gas flares. Massive expansion in fracking since 2010. There's been a little decline, but it's still huge amounts of infrastructural investment, which are generating nighttime lights, even though populations are low, although populations have increased because you need workers in order to do all that extraction. So this is a couple visualizations from New York Times, Gregor Eisch, where he depicted above ground, just for visualization purposes, the infrastructures of fracking so that we can try to get a sense of how large they are. This is one visualization, but the one that makes it even more stark is he puts it at scale. So over in the right, you see WTC-1. So that's obviously one of the biggest towers in Manhattan. And look at how massive these fracking infrastructures are relative to them. So we're dealing with kind of mega industrial transformation of a territory, of a landscape. It's designed, everyone. This is designed. It may not be designed by architects or planners, although I'm sure they're involved, but the big picture is also designed. And it's at a scale that, maybe it wouldn't make a modernist urban planner blush, but they would maybe nod their head approvingly, like, yes, it's colossal. So that's going on all around us. So in light of all of this, we need to go back to the nighttime lights with a certain critical skepticism. And that's exactly what we did in our series of research studios on the extreme territories of urbanization. For me, given the kind of framework that I've been trying to develop here, what's most striking about the nighttime lights is not how many lights they are or how widely they're distributed, but how empty the map is. Most of the map looks like nothing is going on. We know from the history of colonial cartography that anytime anyone represents a space as empty, that is an ideology of colonization. In other words, emptiness may be a project, sometimes a quite genocidal project, as we know from the history of colonial cartography, rather than just a pre-given situation. And I suggest we can productively look at the nighttime lights data set and resultant images with a similar kind of critical awareness. And that's what we have done in our group. So we decided to specifically look in our studio at the putatively empty areas and see what we could find out. The Pacific Ocean, the Amazon, the Arctic, the atmosphere itself, the Sahara, the Himalayas, the Gobi Desert Steppe, and Siberia. So precisely zones that, from the point of view of the nighttime lights, have nothing to do with urbanization. They're completely empty. Nothing's going on there. And through a series of research protocols, we tried to develop some counter maps. And I just want to direct your attention to one conceptual distinction here that really informs not just this work, but my whole alternative approach to contemporary urbanization. For me, the key categories of capitalist forms of urbanization are these: intensification of land use, expansion and reconfiguration of connectivity infrastructures, and intensification of socio-environmental metabolism. Connectivity, intensity, metabolism. Connectivity, intensity, metabolism. Many morphologies, many spatial configurations emerge through the project of intensifying land use, expanding interspatial connectivity, and intensifying and accelerating socio-environmental metabolism. And tracking those actually reveals quite a lot about the metabolism of urbanization. It includes traditional dynamics that are focused on agglomeration. It doesn't marginalize them at all, but it opens up much broader processes, such that we don't define the urban in some singular morphological way. We look at broader processes. So I'll just share with you some of the results. I mean, this is actually still an ongoing project, which we would love at some point, if we have the opportunity and the resources, to publish a volume on. Some of our exhibitions, I think, have been productive, but we could do quite a lot more. But just to share with you, so Gurga basically the bottom line, the takeaway from all these images, I won't go into too much detail because I realize that we need to open up for discussion at this point. But the bottom line is just that they immediately are no longer empty. They're fully filled with evidence of transformation, struggle, contestation. So the Arctic by Gurga Basic, so geographies of resource extraction, oil exploration. Another Arctic set of depictions from Ali Fard and Ghazal Jafari. So it's a highly contested zone of hinterland transformation. The Amazon has been studied quite extensively, and we build upon literatures on extended urbanization in Brazil, particularly the work of Roberto Luiz Montemor. But many geographies of connectivity expansion in the wake of the URSA, which I mentioned earlier, a kind of continent-wide project of expanding infrastructural connectivity, but also many struggles in this context. This is also, of course, the case in the Arctic, related to indigenous rights and indigenous land use struggles. The Sahara Desert, highly contested zone of land use intensification and kind of zonal delineation of certain concessions for oil extraction. Also new connectivity infrastructures being extended across the landscape. All of these have their own periodizations, but what we found in our work on all of the 8 territories is that since the 1980s, there's been a particularly dramatic intensification of investment and strategies of what I call operationalization of the territory. So they have long colonial histories, but those histories have pretty much across all the different zones. This is one of the surprising, really unexpected results of our work thus far, was to see kind of post-1989, roughly, as a watershed of really quite dramatic intensification of enclosures and investments related to industrialization processes. The Himalayas, I just read an article in The Guardian yesterday about Tibet and talking about the ways in which the water supplies of Tibet are increasingly being colonized by a rapidly urbanizing China. This is basically what Vineet Dawadkar was looking at in his study of the Himalayas and the infrastructuralization of the Himalayas on the South Asian side, but it's basically the same point on both, in relation to both the South Asian and the Chinese urban systems, that the Himalayas provide a key metabolic resource for irrigation and also for energetics that's more intensively being operationalized in recent years. Similar arguments about the Gobi Desert, which I have a lot to say about, but I'll skip. And then finally, I've made the point a few times already, I want to make it again, the oceans become a zone of urbanization. Resource extraction, biomass extraction, connectivity infrastructures. What Matthew Brown did here was he juxtaposed various representations of circuits and flows of extraction and logistics to the circles or the exclusive economic zones. So basically the zones in which individual states can claim sovereign authority over what goes on. There's a burgeoning field, which I have a doctoral student at MIT who's actually writing about. There's a burgeoning field of marine spatial planning, which is an absolutely fascinating development of many states around the world are increasingly trying to much more systematically territorialize and plan the various kinds of operations and ecologies within these exclusive economic zones. So this is another terrain of kind of territorialization that I would directly connect to urbanization. And then finally, the atmosphere. Again, a lot could be said. Rob Dario and Melanie Park did some brilliant visualizations of space junk and satellite orbits and connecting it back to various launch sites on the ground. And actually you can find this on YouTube. If you plug this into YouTube, Chris Bennett, it's actually a video animation where he plotted the evolution of all the different launch sites of all the satellites since the launch of Sputnik. And he calibrated that with the orbital height of the satellites, low Earth, medium Earth, high Earth, and geosynchronous orbit. And so you see the evolution of more and more satellites going up into high Earth orbit, and also the evolution of where the satellites are launched from. It also gets into the question of the degree to which space launch activity is increasingly privatized in this age of neoliberal capitalism. So back in the Cold War and even into the 1980s, deep into the 1980s, it's obviously states that are doing the launches, but now it's SpaceX, Elon Musk and so forth, who are using the infrastructures inherited from the Cold War. So all of these geographies are also related to urbanization. Again, I gave the example before of the smartphone. So our everyday coordination in urban space for Georg Simmel, writing in 1903, was the pocket watch. He said that if all the pocket watches in the city were to stop working simultaneously, the whole city would go into chaos. And today it's basically the equivalent. It's not the pocket watch, it's this, or your own version of this, plus all the satellites that are, that are helping us coordinate our everyday lives. So the space-time of urban coordination has been planetarized, but also extended up to the atmosphere. So super fast, 5 propositions by way of conclusion. And I promise I won't comment on the propositions. I'll just read them because I realize I've gone on for more than an hour, and I want to hear your reactions to this, hopefully, to this set of provocations. So first proposition, there are many forms of agglomeration and many scales. So there's no singular form of the city, the agglomeration. We need to pluralize it. We need to think about the multiplication of sociospatial arrangements associated with this admittedly essential moment of agglomeration. Second, been arguing all along, urban agglomerations tightly intertwined with socio-environmental transformations outside or beyond the big population centers. And for me, these are not secondary or derivative. They're primary, essential elements of urbanization as such. For me, any theory of urbanization that doesn't systematically look at those is too narrow. That proposition gets me in a lot of trouble. And maybe it'll get me in trouble with you, but that's what I believe. So I make a distinction basically between concentrated and extended urbanization. The moment of agglomeration, and then the moment of constructing industrial hinterlands or operational landscapes to support agglomeration. Third concluding proposition, the non-city outside. I don't think we have a terminology for it. Rem Koolhaas is doing an exhibition this fall, I believe, at the Whitney on the countryside. It'll be super interesting to see what Rem does, But it's interesting to me that he calls it the countryside. Maybe that way we think we know what we're talking about, but I think part of what's going to emerge based on what I've read about it so far is that, well, the countryside ain't what it used to be. It's not what we think it is. And I would agree with Rem on that one. I think, well, we'll see what he ends up saying, but I'm arguing something similar. The non-city outside is being transformed. It's being enclosed, it's being infrastructuralized, it's being industrialized within a planetary urban fabric. So we need a new vocabulary for trying to understand that and for trying to influence that. Fourth proposition. So for me, the hinterland, the countryside, is a strategic terrain of urbanization, but not in the sense that there are new cities or settlements being built there. That's definitely the case. There are new centers that are crystallizing, and that's part of the story. But for me, the key issue is operational landscape. So this is fundamental. In other words, there may not be a lot of people in the countryside. And I would argue with some of my collaborators that depeasantization, the dismantling of the global peasantry, in other words, people who live off the land, that's a dominant trend into the early 21st century. But nonetheless, that decline of population, and it's not just a natural, as it were, decline, it's an eviction. It's a dispossession of people from the countryside. That's directly connected to the operationalization of the hinterland. So we need to look at the hinterland using this kind of, we might call it a post-human lens, through which to see what's going on there without just focusing on demographic factors. So final one, I promise. So for me, in light of all this, the specificity of planetary urbanization, it's not everything is urbanized in the same way, the whole world is a singular shell or grid of kind of continuous urban fabric, nor is it the mainstream idea of the universalization of the city. I don't really think the city is being universalized. I think there are different patterns and pathways of urban agglomeration. But for me, the real specificity is really less about that, as important as that agglomeration moment is, than the intensification, the intensified operationalization of the hinterland, the non-city putative outside, to support the extension of urban growth. So it's precisely for me places like this that we need to direct our attention to. Again, not to ignore the cities, but we need to situate them in relation to places like this in order to understand urban dynamics. And also, I wanted to conclude with this, struggles. Whole range of new political struggles over resource extraction and closure, alternative modes of agrarian life, and pipeline politics, which also articulates to indigenous struggles, are very much urban struggles. It's not just kind of defending, conserving the past, but reinventing those spaces in the context of a kind of ecologically disastrous formation of planetary capitalism. Thank you very much. And thank you all for listening to a lecture that was well over an hour. I greatly appreciate your patience. If you're willing to stay a little bit longer, I certainly am. I'd love to hear your reactions. And your criticisms. I think we need the mic in order to get it on live stream, although if it's a quick one, I can just repeat it. Oh, really? Well, the people on live stream might want to hear your thoughts. Try again. Well, I'll tell you what. Why don't you ask your question, and I'll repeat it anyway.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you.
So I was really interested in the image that you showed about the eclipse of the city, right? To understand all the relationships. And I guess what I'm wondering about is, this is bringing it back home to Miami, because many people see, when we talk about climate change or people talk about resilience, what everyone talks about is the stuff, right, of the city. So for example, if we have 2 feet of water and we're at 17 feet above sea level, or in parts of the university 5 feet above sea level, then we're fine because the water's down there. And that's because we're thinking about the buildings. But if we really think about the processes, if we think about Mount Trashmore, if we think about the water and the sewer, and we understand that in fact we'd be living in this toxic stew, and even, a foot of sea level would actually decimate the life as we know it. That is not a commonly understood concept. So my question is, do you think if we mapped it or drew it in the way that you're talking about, where we revealed all the systems that are the things that are damaged and didn't focus on the place, do you think that would make that a more powerful and better understood concept?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and it's absolutely fundamental, and here's some thoughts on it. So certainly in terms of politics and political mobilization, place and territory matter. In other words, to mobilize resources, to mobilize tax dollars, to get legal permission to do interventions, you need jurisdictional approval. So there's no way to just kind of adopt some kind of planetary metabolic perspective and think that anything is going to get done. So I think that in terms of the pragmatics, you need a legal framework. But, and you knew there was going to be a but at the same time, as I think you very correctly point out, the issues related to climate change and many other issues related to urban metabolism are planetary. They connect to and embody what Darwin famously called the web of life. It's the web of life. It's everyone, every human, non-human, we're all connected to one another. And part of what design is, for me, is manage, envision, and transform the way the web of life is organized. And in that sense, approaches to sustainability or ecological justice have to grapple with the web of life. And here I would just direct attention to what I see as one of the major dangers of dominant approaches in politics to climate change at the local scale, which is basically to find extremely, or to search for and struggle for extremely localized and circumscribed solutions, which might protect, Miami Beach for a little while, but leave open larger territories, including marginalized populations within those larger territories, to extreme vulnerability. So there's a critical geographer who refers to this as the construction of premium ecological enclaves. Premium ecological enclaves. And basically the argument is just that. The strategy of creating enclaves of at least potential or provisional security and provisional safety for the wealthy and the advantaged, meanwhile bracketing and sometimes directly intensifying danger, insecurity, risk for poor people, and it's of course not only class but also racialized in all kinds of profound ways. I recently read a doctoral thesis which was about, among other things, climate change adaptation strategies on Jakarta, which are, as some of you may know, very mega-scaled projects are being developed. And it was another version of the same thing. And this is by a former doctoral student of mine, Kian Go, who's now teaching in the planning department at UCLA. And part of what Kian did was she looked at, sort of, on the one hand, mega infrastructural projects to try to protect particular central districts of Jakarta, and then on the other hand, she looked at the kampung, which are the kind of more informalized everyday spaces where ordinary people live, which are being even more directly threatened by rising sea level. And there are a whole other range of issues in Jakarta, as many of you may know. So I think this is, it's extremely problematic also because, and this I think articulates to Miami, people may have a false sense of security. In other words, you raise the sidewalks, you put in some pumps, and you think, okay, we've solved it. We have a good life, and we can survive the hurricanes and the other threats, and everyone else be damned. And that's very dangerous. Ultimately, it's a scale question. And okay, we're probably not going to devise a single infrastructural solution. Hopefully we never will at a planetary scale. But we need super-local approaches. We need territorial approaches. That could be in the county, that could be in the state. And at least in the US context, we need a federal government that actively facilitates and funds regional, like much larger scaled solutions that to all of the issues, which of course will necessarily need to include retreat, as well as just kind of barricading and pumping and all the rest of it. Okay, so now you can see my ridiculous screensaver, which, I don't know if you have this problem, but when I got a new computer and now I'm always looking at a new image every time I log in, which, the last one was the lighthouse at Key Biscayne, just, Windows had it, but for some reason, all right, let me just go back to my slide, 1 second. Other questions? Comments?
Yeah, I have a question in terms of like time horizons when you present this kind of data. So thinking about operational landscapes, like you mentioned it around the end, where from the 1980s onward there was an acceleration, but then thinking like what are centers now that are accelerating in a different way? Because I keep thinking about using Miami again as an example, where the port, Miami as an example, where the port has a direct tunnel to the expressway, so it has a direct tunnel to infrastructure. So even if there are larger effects of climate change affect the city, like in terms of population, the port will still function quite perfectly. You raise the port, everything's already there, and you already have a direct entrance to the expressway. So
Interesting.
I guess to kind of clarify it a bit more, kind of like planning for operational landscapes in the future.
Yeah.
That makes sense?
No, it makes perfect sense. It's a super interesting question. I would say a couple things. I mean, a lot more can be said, first of all, about what happened after. Me and Christian Schmidt refer to it as the long 1980s. It's a whole bunch of different things. It's the collapse of communism. It's the consolidation of kind of neoliberal free market economics. It's the increasing trend towards financialization, which leads to, among other things, a lot of new infrastructural investment in, for example, primary commodity production in the global south. Because speculative investment on future commodity prices often leads to sort of new anticipations of profits, which in turn can actually drive investments, which they might be very speculative and lead nowhere, but they drive land use change. So there are a whole lot of factors that kind of cascade. And they, again, I should emphasize, even though I said that it was surprising that we saw such similar changes happening post-1990s in all these different zones, there are regionally, or at least, I would say, continent-specific, broadly construed patterns and pathways. In other words, the forms of infrastructural investment, the political strategies, the territorial development strategies, let's say in the Arctic, are going to be different than in Siberia or in the Amazon. It depends on history, it depends on politics, it depends on struggle. But there's a wave of enclosure and infrastructuralization and dispossession, ecological plunder that is dangerous, disastrous, unjust, and we have to do something about it. And part of my kind of, just emotional attachment to this project in a certain way is that I don't think this is being talked about in public discourse. There's some counter tendencies, but it's just black boxed. And it's, to me, that's extraordinary given the stakes, socially, politically, and environmentally. So that's one. In terms of the Miami part of your question, it's a very interesting reflection. So, and it comes back to the question about, sort of broader politics of climate change. In the face of climate threats, which are all around us, not just along the coastline, they're cascading across the planet in ways that we do not understand and which are, we're experiencing in all of our lifetimes. And the temporal scales, it's not like every 5 years or every 10 years. It's, it's internal to the yearly cycle. The very notion of a cycle is being changed. So, so climate security, what could it mean in this context of rapid, kind of pulsing change? And the one question among many that's raised by your reflection is this. Does climate security mean you create mechanisms to protect expensive, economically valuable infrastructure, like the port, or like a server farm? It's a good example. All the cloud that we talk about, like that's massive energy-intensive infrastructure, much of which is away from big cities. Or do you actually create an approach to climate change, climate security that protects populations? And if you say, okay, the latter, we're going to protect populations, it's exactly the exchange we just had. Where does the investment in creating climate security for populations go? Does it go to high income earners? Does it go to everybody, whether you're a citizen or not, whether you make a lot of money or whether you're unemployed, whether you're black or white, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Like, go down the list. And once you start to ask that question, you immediately see that the question of climate security, it is a technical and scientific one, but it's also a deeply political one. And we need, like, my whole kind of, I don't know, idea of like what we need. I mean, I know a lot of people here also are thinking about this in fundamental ways. We need new frameworks for collaboration within the university. This is what the university is for, precisely to reinvent the fields that we work in order to deal with challenges that we are desperate in the face of. And if we think of science and kind of political theory as like diametrically opposed, these kinds of conversations can't happen. You need the humanities, the spatial humanities. You need ecology and environmental studies. You certainly need design. You need social science. So I think your question kind of opens up those, in some ways, broader questions. I don't know the answers, but part of I feel like my mission as a professor is to try to pose constantly those questions in the hopes that the conversations might lead in a direction that could be productive.
Thank you, Neil. This is fascinating. I'm just trying to digest a lot of the things you were saying. And this is a broader sense, and it relates even to this eclipse idea, this trope. If you're developing these experimental models that are open-ended, which I completely get that, and they're maybe not as referential as they used to be, and kind of very flexible, like as you said at the beginning, so they can change rapidly with all this rapid change in our global situation. Isn't the idea of a trope, which is such a traditional urbanistic thing, going back to the stomach and the lungs, and the microscope, isn't there a danger of the eclipse kind of eclipsing the complexity and the interaction? You're going to leave something out. Yep. So maybe just the whole narrative structure of looking at the urbanistic problem is so complex that we need a narrative, right? We need a metaphor, we need a trope, but that's a problem.
Yeah.
Or what do you think of that?
Yeah, no, that's super fascinating, and I completely take your point. I mean, a couple reflections. One would be that, to some degree, the prominence of the deconstructive tropes, in the plural, in this presentation and a lot of my current work, or recent work, is related to the point I was making earlier about the dangers, the deep dangers I see related to the black boxing of the hinterland, the invisibilization, as it were, the rendering invisible of the hinterland. So in other words, all narratives are situated in a context, in a historical, spatial, political, et cetera, context. So this narrative and the work that me and my collaborators are developing, it's situated in a context of the city is back in town, as it were. The city is where it's at, and we can do all these things by focusing on the city. And I do not disagree with that. I disagree with it to the degree that that's presented as the whole story. So the prominence of the deconstructive moment makes sense in that context. We need to put the city under eclipse because the brightness of the discourse is so blinding. If we were in 1965 having this conversation, when the dominant trope one dominant trope, not the only one, but a key dominant trope of planning and design and urban discourse was the predominance of the national economy as a self-enclosed territorial space embedded within a world system, then maybe I would be making a different argument, which would be a critique of the nation-state frame for thinking about urban systems as national, for example. So in other words, the target, the sort of, something is always occluding things that we care about, and sort of critical theory is in part about sort of choosing particular issues whose occlusion may be strategically significant, such that if you open up alternative perspectives, it might illuminate. It's a very pragmatist approach, actually, in the literally in the William James sense of pragmatist, that it's connected to, developing theory is connected to matters of concern in a particular socio-historical context. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, I take your point. In other words, is it possible, once all the deconstructive maneuvering is over, to actually say, okay, what exactly is your vision, your meta-theoretical perspective on urbanization that includes everything you think is important and excludes whatever you think is not important? And I have some ideas on that. I won't try to elaborate them here, but I'm not, let me just say, in terms of where your question is pointing me, I'm not averse to doing that. But at the same time, even if I were to write like my own, here's my theory of capitalist urbanization, I would insist in writing it, this is a theory that emerges in a specific time and place in relation to specific problematiques. And this theory, too, has blind spots which hopefully future generations, or maybe even right after the book's publication, will be critically interrogated. But for me, the point is, critically interrogating a blind spot, the point, if it's going to be an interesting conversation, is not just to say, oh, this author got it wrong, what a moron, but rather the critical deconstruction is hopefully generative when it's a productive dialogue. In other words, you critically engage with, maybe deconstruct someone else's perspective, but in order to open up an alternative, maybe more illuminating approach. And that's, the hermeneutics of theory. Like, it's always evolving in a context. And the question that we have to grapple with in academia is, what are the terms of that dialogue? Are they moving in productive directions? Are they not?
Or is the urban laboratory as an idea maybe a closed system even?
Say that last part again, sorry.
Or is the idea of an urban laboratory, urban experiment, going back to the Media Lab or whatever, whenever that began in the 60s, I think really, and Banham had a lot to do with that, I think. Does that itself become a closed system? Complex, but closed in terms of...
That leads, I think, to another question, which is you spent quite a bit of time Friday and then at the beginning today talking to us about the reason for theory and that it's supposed to be useful. And so up to now, it seems as if all of and including the questions were about getting the analysis right, or, how do you get the theory right?
Yep.
But how do you move into practice?
Yep.
How do we use that? How do we use all of that and not fall into the critique that it's making?
Yeah, exactly. So basically, so a couple layers to a response. But the most important one is that on the level of abstraction that I'm working on in this kind of a project, there are many answers to that question. There can be, by definition, no single answer, because theory is an abstraction. So I think that's something that emerges, like I frame my work on that high level of abstraction, and then in subsequent conversations, maybe it can be articulated to practice. So let me just suggest a few ways. The most general way is that, and again, this is not something that will be unfamiliar to people in this room. This is hopefully reinforcing something that people are already committed to and doing, but it's just giving maybe a different or maybe new theoretical impetus behind that. Simply that all design problems that are of significance to us, almost without exception, are multi-scalar. And anytime we bound a scale, sometimes it's necessary to do that. Of course, it depends on your client and the broader parameters within which you're working. But even if you have to bound it in the context of developing your project, developing your design, in your thought process, in your analysis of the problematique, it's fundamental to have a perspective that connects the site to many, many other sites and scales. And that's an ongoing discourse and debate within design. And I think I'm adding some momentum behind that. So that would be one, or adding some sort of theoretical tools for that kind of a project of connecting up various scales on which almost any design problem is articulated. The second specific kind of practical dimension of all this, for me, is exactly the question of metabolism. So all design questions related to the urban, for me, in some ways, need to be connected back to the sort of broader metabolic flows that animate and result from urbanization. And as designers, like this is kind of a fundamental commitment to me, for me, I think whatever subfield of design anyone works in, we need to be experts. Not just aware, but I think we need expertise in our disciplines related to the metabolism of urbanization. And I think many of you are, but I'm kind of arguing that as just kind of like a fundamental commitment pedagogically and professionally. Water, food, land use within and beyond the city, energetics, waste, labor. Like those are fundamental constitutive dimensions of the web of life, which is animated by urbanization. And that's the stuff, literally, of design. The German word for metabolism is actually quite relevant here. It's Stoffwechsel. Stoffwechsel. It literally means the transformation of stuff. Like Stoff just means the stuff. So that's, that's, I don't know what people think, but I think that is the problematic of design. It's Stoffwechsel. It's designing Stoffwechsel. It's designing the metabolism. And the built environment is the result of earlier Stoffwechsel. It's the result of earlier metabolism. And we shape and reshape the built environment and the unbuilt environment, because the built environment is connected somewhere eventually to unbuilt environment before it gets assembled into the built. So the whole built-unbuilt distinction, I'm not satisfied just to say, oh, we deal with the built. Because if you're dealing with the built, you're also dealing with the unbuilt, both upstream from whatever you're building and downstream. At some point, buildings die. Buildings are obsolete and transformed into something else. So that as kind of a frame, that's still a pretty abstract answer, but I think that can have productive implications for how we think about the practice within the parameters of design and as it's currently constituted, but also perhaps within the parameters of some future framework of design. I mean, that's part of what this is all about too, is that, I hope it's clear, I think we need to constantly reinvent our disciplines in relation to a changing world. So when I teach the history theory of urban planning or urban interventions, part of what I'm really interested in is the way that earlier traditions of urban planning tried to reinvent what the problematique of planning actually is. And part of why I care about that is, I'm interested in historical transformations just as a scholar, but I'm also interested in historical transformations and reinventions of disciplines in relation to our current situation, where I also think we need to reinvent. So what can we learn, not just from earlier ideas, but earlier attempts to reinvent?
Thank you. More questions? Maybe individually? People will, oh, yes, I was surprised the dean didn't have one earlier.
There's no doubt there's this, what did you call it, the ecological plundering? What was your, but don't you think that it's really very much at the forefront of current discussions? Even it's very much looming in the cultural imaginary. Like your last slide of the pipeline struggle, I mean, it's everywhere in the media. So Mike, I'm a bit, I want to challenge you about this idea of the black boxing and the narrative you are proposing of the kind of the false consciousness that is latent in the discourse on urbanization and its obfuscation of the processes that you're describing. I'm not sure they are really obfuscated. It is right there. It's like they are in plain sight, those processes.
Yeah, interesting. I take the point, and I could be exaggerating in the sense that, I mentioned earlier the Koolhaas exhibition.
Right. Now that Koolhaas is going to talk about it, that's it.
It's over. It's like the black boxing is over, and then let's see what he does. Right. Like, let's see what he does. Like, I've read a few articles reporting on it, and some GSD students are in the studio, but I just, I have no idea. It's a kind of remarkable turn for, one of the great sort of thinkers and practitioners of architectural urbanism, in quotation marks, because that's obviously a contested term. So I take your point, but I would still dig in my heels on a few things. So, yes, it would be an exaggeration to say, oh, it's completely black boxed. Nobody's talking about or politicizing the hinterland. And it's interesting to ask who is unblack boxing it. Maybe REM, a kind of indigenous struggles, debates about kind of ecological sustainability and territorial preservation. But the flip side would be something like this. Contemporary debates about sustainability, urban sustainability, contemporary debates about urban informality, and contemporary debates about the smart city. Like, those are three major urban discourses in the contemporary moment, which I think people here are interested, and I certainly am interested in all of those. And I would argue in each of those debates, and again, they're debates, so there are positions and counterpositions, but I would argue the dominant mainstream position presents the city as bounded, self-enclosed, and self-sufficient. In the sustainability discourse, the idea is to minimize the emissions of producers and consumers in the city. There are counter approaches, which, including very quantitative ones, which are fundamental, which look at the emissions from logistics and extraction of the stuff that's consumed in the city. But the dominant discourse is kind of make the city an ecological enclave. So we can debate about it, but I think that's a dominant trend. In terms of informality and informalization, a fundamental debate about cities in the global south, what we used to call the third world, and the kind of proliferation of informal, or what Teresa Caldera calls peripheral urbanization, so self-built settlements. So the dominant discourse, including within design, and again, I wouldn't dismiss it, but I'm just characterizing its framework, is how can we provide infrastructure, housing, etc., to all of these people from the countryside who are moving by millions and millions and millions into the city? And again, that's a fundamental question. But I would say, well, let's actually look upstream. What's going on in India, in China, in parts of Southeast Asia, in different zones of Latin America, that's making it impossible for people to survive, to have a decent life in the broader territories? And if you look at that, you find that it's not just a natural rural to urban migration at all. It is enclosure, dispossession, eviction. And there are industrial processes, often, and ecological processes behind it, as well as geopolitical military processes, war and so forth. So that's the informal. And the smart city, you know much more about that than I, but it's an interesting question. I think a lot of the literature that I encounter treats sort of the smart city as kind of a techno-utopia whose spatiality is basically characterized by its nodal properties. In other words, dense agglomerations in which you can wire and layer various kinds of sensors and monitoring systems. And a lot of that is premised upon the interest of smart city corporations in smart big data, smart city corporations in the users. In other words, they're precisely interested in the populations because the populations are the ones whose data make the thing potentially profitable. So the question of, again, I learned so much from my doctoral students. So another recent doctoral student of mine, Ali Fard, wrote a brilliant doctoral thesis on cloud urbanism, he called it. And a lot of it was about mapping the storage facilities and telecommunications infrastructure of Google. So Google's now laying out its own submarine cables. It's not just renting the cables from other corporations. It's basically creating a planetary infrastructure that's privately owned by Google. So the whole, and all the server farms, and I read a few articles about this separately from Ali Fard's thesis, the incredible energy intensivity of a server farm to store all the data. It is unbelievable. Some of these server farms, in terms of their energetic consumption, they exceed that of a large city. So, and that's, again, you can find, journalists in The Guardian or other places who write about it, but the dominant discourse is kind of like, let's build our kind of smart urban neighborhood in Toronto and wire it, and it'll be kind of a techno-utopia for the, the smart city elites. And what about the kind of broader ecological, energetic, metabolic processes that support it? So I think it's not that those discourses, those more territorial hinterland discourses don't exist, but they're black boxed in different ways in each of those different discourses. Or maybe black boxed is too strong of a word, but I would say they're marginalized. And furthermore, that if we give them more prominence in our scholarship and in our practice, it opens up very important design questions, and questions of practice, I would argue.
Of course, one thing is to say that they're neglected and that we should look at these things, and another to imply that there is some kind of a obfuscation built into the very discourse of urbanization. And that's very much, I think this is something that the critical theory does by building the straw man, right? And revels in the kind of the thrill of the deconstruction itself, right? Right.
I see where you, sorry. I see your point, and I'm actually I'm sympathetic to that critique of the critique. In other words, if certain traditions of critical theory, again, there are Marxian versions of it, there are Foucauldian versions of it, there are Latourian versions of it. They present power as this kind of omnipresent, devious, systemic, all-knowing process, and then deconstructing it, you suddenly reveal like all of these unknown, hidden things, and that kind of caricature is something I definitely wouldn't want to give you the impression that I'm doing that. My point really is simply that there are some shared kind of deep epistemological assumptions about the city which underpin otherwise quite heterogeneous discourses. So if we were to drill into this kind of line of argumentation related to the three examples I gave, the informal housing, another one would be agglomeration economies. So a field I've worked a lot in, into urban geography, of just the whole debate on agglomeration. It's, we'd have to flesh out some much more specific lines of argumentation. The particular form of city-centric urban theory in agglomeration economics, it articulates to, but is also different from the smart city, the informal urbanization, and the, what was the other one I mentioned? The sustainable urbanism. So I fully, like theory is, for me, not some kind of stance of abstraction through which to bypass or ignore those particularities of different debates and discourses. But in this particular presentation, I do see enough parallels among the meta-geographical and meta-epistemological frames that are used that it's kind of, I don't know how often I'll do this in future projects, but for this project, it's kind of a moment where I'm kind of saying, well, there's an underlying episteme, and it's deeply problematic across all these different fields. It definitely gets me into some debates and arguments, some of which are not particularly pleasant, but in part they're not pleasant because the response is often even more totalizing and caricaturing than what I'm accused of doing. But the hope is that whatever emerges, maybe at least certain issues are put on the table such that we can maybe more explicitly and reflexively frame some of these things. And if folks who are doing, whether it's agglomeration economics or sustainable urbanism or smart city or informality, agree, the hinterland question, urban metabolism is fundamental, I'll be like, great, I'll shut down the project and let's study the hinterland. I mean, my project is basically the hinterland question. I don't want to spend, the next 5 years of my life doing this meta-theoretical critique. Like, I'm done with it. I want to actually analyze operational landscapes, the transformation of the hinterland, and how that kind of analysis can inform potential strategies of planning and design. Like, that's where I want to go with it. So metabolic urbanization, planetary urbanization, it's not just a meta-theoretical stance, it's a research agenda. And I'm kind of, again, between us, like I'm sort of getting sick of the critique at this point. It is what it is, and I want to, get on with the project, which is what I'm, trying to do, although I think the critique still actually needs to be made, unfortunately. Anyone else? I've got lots of energy, but some of y'all understandably look a little exhausted, and you've got to go, which I understand. Thank you all for persisting through this long lecture and discussion. And thanks for your critical engagement. I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of these ideas with you. No pipeline. you.